Excellencies and distinguished guests, before we start the program, I would request everybody to kindly switch off their mobile or put them in silent mode. Thank you. Excellencies and distinguished guests, on behalf of the Permanent Mission of India, I welcome all of you for joining us today at this special event to commemorate the 125th birth anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar here at the United Nations. We are privileged to have amongst us today Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark, Administrator of United Nations Development Programme, His Excellency Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, Permanent Representative of India, His Excellency Mr. Charanjit Atwal, Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly, Padma Shri Kalpana Saroj of Kalpana Saroj Foundation, and Mr. Dilip Mahaske, President of Foundation for Human Horizon, on the dais with us. Now, with the start of the program, I request Permanent Representative of India, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, to kindly deliver the welcome remarks. Ambassador, please. Thank you.
Helen Clark, Administrator, UNDP, Mr. Charanjit Singh Atwal, the Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly, Ms. Kalpana Saroj of the Kalpana Saroj Foundation, Mr. Dilip Maske, President of the Foundation of Human Horizon. Ladies and gentlemen, it is for me personally an honor and a privilege to welcome you to this seminal event at the United Nations. Observing the birth centenary of Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar is now somewhat of a tradition in modern India. He was the principal architect of the Indian Constitution and independent India's first law minister, a social reformer, a jurist, economist, an author, and a scholar of comparative religions. In short, he was a multifaceted personality who braved the walls of prejudice and discrimination in early 20th century India to emerge as an exemplar and an unflinching crusader against the social inequities and economic deprivation that afflicted millions of Indians then. This year, thanks to the support of civil society advocacy groups, such as those led by Ms. Kalpana Saroj, a woman entrepreneur whose life story is itself remarkable in many ways, and the Foundation of Human Horizons, led by the young activist Mr. Dilip Maske, we've taken a leap of faith. For the first time, we have ventured to host an event at the United Nations. We do this based on the thinking that it is best put in Dr. Ambedkar's own words, and I quote, "Men are mortal, so are ideas. An idea needs propagation as much as a plant needs watering. Otherwise, both will wither and die." Today, we have gathered to recall both Dr. Ambedkar the man and his ideas. He was, for all of us, a modern-day giant whose life and philosophy is a profile in courage and conviction. A reformer who strides in the league of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela as a champion of the downtrodden and a conscience keeper. Last year, when the United Nations adopted the Universal and Transformative Agenda 2030 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets, we as Indians noticed traces of Dr. Ambedkar's vision in the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me try and provide some examples of how we see these linkages. Reducing inequality is both a standalone goal of the Sustainable Development Goal number 10 and a cross-cutting issue across all Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Ambedkar fashioned a pluralistic and inclusive Indian Constitution guaranteeing equal opportunity and freedom of expression and faith for all citizens in a secular democracy. The Constitution drafted under his leadership abolished untouchability, outlawed all forms of discrimination. Yet, Dr. Ambedkar himself also recognized that the quest for substantive equality and justice would remain a work in progress. As he said, and I quote, "In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? This need to combat inequalities both within and among countries remains our quest even today, as reflected in Agenda 2030. Let me give you another example of the commonality of vision. This relates to Goal 5 of the SDGs, which aims at achieving gender equality as crucial to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Dr. Ambedkar's political vocabulary was one of gender empowerment and is best summarized in his statement, and I quote, "I measure the progress of a community by the degree of progress which women have achieved." These were words spoken more than a century ago. Pursuing this, Dr. Ambedkar provided for special provisions for women's equality, both in formal and sustainable senses in India's Constitution. While other provisions of the Constitutions are applicable to women as to men, there are also provisions in our Constitution that enable affirmative action in favor of women to ensure that no one is left behind, a key message of Agenda 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, as a historian of an earlier generation once put it, India embraces in its orbit beliefs, customs, rights, institutions, arts, religion, and philosophies belonging to different strata of societies in varying degrees of development. It eternally seeks to find a unity for the heterogeneous elements which make up its totality, a thought that our Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, has summarized in his clarion call, "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas," meaning together with all, development for all. It is in this spirit that we have today approached the keynote speaker and other panelists, including from Dr. Ambedkar's alma mater, Columbia University. We are deeply appreciative of their willingness to join us here. With these introductory remarks, I am pleased to invite Ms. Helen Clark to make her keynote statement. As you are aware, Ms. Clark is the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and is the chair of the United Nations Development Group. The United Nations Development Programme plays a crucial role in helping developing countries in their efforts to implement Agenda 2030 and achieve sustainable development. Ms. Clark, those of you who have followed her are aware, has served as the Prime Minister of New Zealand for 3 terms. During her career in public service, she has widely engaged in policy development and advocacy across economic, social, and cultural spheres. In many ways, she has championed the cause for a fairer and better world. We are grateful to her for sparing the time to share her thoughts with us today on issues relating to combating inequalities for the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. Madam, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Speaker of the Punjab Legislative Assembly, Kalpana Saroj, Dilip Mahaske, Excellencies, and all who've come to join this celebration of Dr. Ambedkar's life. And thank you, Ambassador, for inviting me to deliver the keynote speech this afternoon. Well, we are talking about the legacy of a very great man, a founding father of the Constitution of India, and a man who understood that rising and persistent inequalities will pose fundamental challenges to the economic and social well-being of nations and people. His work on the empowerment and inclusion of excluded groups, on the reform of the labour laws of India, and the promotion of education for all made him an icon for the poor and marginalised people in India and in other countries. The ideals for which he worked so hard are as relevant today as they were when the Indian Constitution was signed into law. Reducing inequalities and discrimination in all their forms is at the very heart of the new global development agenda, which world leaders here in this very building at the United Nations in New York signed onto last September. And that pledge to leave no one behind is at the cornerstone of the new agenda and of the Sustainable Development Goals. It calls on countries at every stage of development to reduce inequalities by tackling the wide disparities between rich and poor, known in many countries. A UNDP study 2 years ago found that in 3/4 of all developing countries, income is more unequally distributed now than it was in 1990, when the Millennium Development Goals baseline was. And it's also important to tackle those biases which are found across, in many places, institutions, legal systems, social norms. These are the drivers of discrimination and inequality. When groups of people are not able to fully access resources, markets, basic services like health and education, and the forums through which their voices can be heard in decision-making processes, the result is entrenched inequality. And this is the situation faced by disadvantaged groups in many countries, whether they be poor, women, rural populations, urban slum populations, marginalised, indigenous communities, or ethnic or other minorities. So our world has work to do. What will it take to achieve the vision of the man whose life we honour today? Well, Dr. Ambedkar had a deep understanding of the far-reaching measures which are needed to reduce inequalities. Today, as when he lived and wrote, all countries have work to do. Let's start with promoting inclusive and sustainable growth, which will generate the decent work needed to address inequalities. The benefits of growth need to be shared across the society. And this calls for economic and social policies which will prioritise lifting the incomes and circumstances of the poor and marginalised at a higher rate than the national average. Then there is the importance of governance, which is responding to the needs of the poorest and most marginalised. This is critical for tackling inequalities. And so for UNDP, building the capacity of governments at the national level and the subnational level and other stakeholders to address the social determinants of inequalities is a central part of our work. And we are partners with many governments in implementing, for example, social and environmental safeguards and grievance mechanisms, and in seeing that communities can have a voice in the decision-making which has an impact on their lives. Giving top priority to leaving no one behind and to poverty eradication are guiding principles for development around the world in the new global agenda. And to eradicate poverty, it is imperative to address inequality in all its dimensions. On behalf of UNDP, I commend India on celebrating this important anniversary here at the United Nations. We are committed to continuing our very close partnership with India to help realise the vision of the 2030 Agenda and ensure that Dr. Ambedkar's vision becomes reality for the poor and marginalised around our world. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.